In the silent forests beyond Sycamore Hills, the townspeople spoke of a ghost, a wounded German shepherd with only one eye, slipping between shadows like a memory no one could name. Most turned away. Some left scraps. None dared approach. Until one cold autumn evening, when a little girl vanished into the woods, and the ghost stepped forward. What followed was not just a rescue, it was a return. Not just for the child, but for a soldier forgotten by war, and a town that had long stopped believing in miracles. Sycamore Hills, Oregon, early October. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the slopes of the surrounding hills, and the air was wet with dew, the kind that soaked through jackets and hung heavy in the lungs. The town was quiet, wrapped in a veil of post-rain stillness, and the sky overhead was a soft gray canvas, light just beginning to leak through. In the forest beyond the last neighborhood cul-de-sac, the earth was spongy with last night's downpour. Birds were silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lucas Yates adjusted the strap of his rescue pack as he moved through the underbrush. A man in his early 40s, Lucas stood just under 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with lines carved into his sun-darkened skin from years in emergency response. His graying brown hair was cropped short and his hazel eyes bore a weight that never seemed to lift, not since the accident that had taken his younger brother, also a ranger, during a rockslide 3 years ago. That loss had made Lucas quieter, more methodical, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice unless absolutely necessary, and even then, it carried a calm that others found grounding. Today, however, there was no room for calm. A child was missing. Emery Collins, age 6, had vanished the night before from the town's annual harvest jubilee. One moment she was tugging at her mother's hand near the hayride station, the next, she was simply gone, drawn, some believed, into the forest by a deer or a balloon or simply the unpredictable whims of childhood. No one had seen where she went. No trail, no sound, just a growing, gnawing absence. Lucas checked his GPS and tapped the shoulder of the young volunteer beside him, a teenager named Ryan whom he barely knew, with shaggy hair and a nervous gait. "We sweep 30 more yards, then cut west toward the riverbend," Lucas said lowly. Ryan just nodded. It was then that the radio crackled. "Yates, come in, possible sighting in Sector 7. You're closest. Coordinates inbound." Lucas's heart thudded as he adjusted course, calling out to Ryan to follow. Branches clawed at their arms as they trudged through the undergrowth, mud sucking at their boots. The mist thickened as they moved into a denser patch of trees, where the light barely penetrated and the ground sloped unevenly toward a sunken hollow. Then he saw it. A shape, barely visible through the fog, nestled beneath a bent pine tree. Lucas slowed, signaling Ryan to stay back. He raised a hand toward his radio, but didn't speak. Instead, he approached with deliberate slowness. The form on the ground resolved into 2 figures, one small, fragile, lying curled and still, and one larger, unmistakably canine. A German shepherd, its fur soaked and matted with dirt and brambles, lay wrapped around the child like a shield. The dog's ribs showed through its sides, its thick black and tan coat caked with dried mud. One of its eyes, a deep amber, locked onto Lucas, gleaming with an intensity both alert and haunting. The other eye socket was empty, scarred over with old trauma. A single low growl rumbled from its throat, not menacing, but protective, a warning etched in loyalty. Lucas crouched slowly. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "I'm not here to hurt her. Or you." From beneath the dog's chest, a pale hand peeked out, limp and chilled. Lucas's throat tightened. "Emery," he called softly. The little girl stirred. Her lips were blue, her skin pale beneath her soaked yellow dress, its hem frayed and dotted with pine needles. Her blonde hair clung to her face in wet strands. But she was breathing. Lucas exhaled. Relief crashed through him like thunder. "We found her," he said into his radio. "Alive. Bring medics. Bring blankets. And bring someone who can handle a dog. Big one." Not aggressive, but watchful. As if understanding, the German shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch, only flicked his ears as voices and footfalls grew nearer. He stayed wrapped around the child, trembling from fatigue but unyielding, a one-eyed sentinel refusing to surrender his post. By the time the rest of the team arrived, the clearing had grown tense with held breaths. One rescuer, Melanie Torres, a petite woman with cropped black hair and a background in veterinary tech, was the first to step forward. She knelt carefully. "I think I know this dog," she whispered to Lucas. "I saw his photo on a military K9 registry years ago. I think his name was Ranger." Lucas glanced at her, then back at the dog. The name fit. The paramedics arrived next. Emery was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, her lips parting in a quiet, hoarse whisper, "Don't let him go." Ranger's ears twitched. He rose stiffly to his feet but did not growl as they wrapped her in blankets. He followed silently, limping, the thick fur of his haunches bristling but controlled. In the clearing's edge stood Grace Collins, Emery's mother. Tall and slender, with wavy chestnut hair tied hastily into a loose bun, Grace looked older than her 33 years. Her face, once warm and expressive, was now drawn, her eyes rimmed with panic. Since losing her firefighter husband 2 years ago to a blaze in Portland, Grace had buried herself in work, serving double shifts as a nurse at the town's only clinic while trying to raise Emery alone. She was known for her competence, her brisk walk through hospital corridors, and her inability to say no to anyone in need. But in her daughter's absence, all her polished strength had fractured. When she saw the stretcher, her knees nearly buckled. "Emery," she cried, rushing forward. Tears streamed down her face as she touched her daughter's cheek. "I'm so sorry. I'm here now, I'm here." Emery, barely conscious, whispered again, "Don't let him go." Only then did Grace see Ranger. Their eyes met. She took in the scars, the missing eye, the soaked fur and the proud but weary posture. But what she felt wasn't fear. It was gratitude so large it hollowed her breath. She knelt beside him. "You stayed with her, when I couldn't." Ranger didn't wag. He didn't move. But something in his gaze softened. Lucas watched them quietly. He had seen war dogs before, trained, loyal, broken by the aftermath of command. But Ranger was something else. A protector forged not in obedience, but in instinct. As medics prepared to transport Emery and the search team ready to leave, Lucas approached Grace. He followed her all night. Never left her side. "I've seen loyalty, but nothing like this." Grace nodded, brushing her sleeve over her cheeks. "Then he comes with us." Some on the team murmured hesitantly, but no one objected aloud. Grace didn't wait for permission. She simply walked beside the dog as they made their way back toward the trucks. And Ranger, limping, ribs showing, followed without command, because somewhere deep in that scarred heart, he'd already chosen. Sycamore Hills, Oregon, dusk settled like a hush over the valley, and the thin October light painted the town in muted golds and grays. The rain had stopped hours ago, but moisture still clung to the forest edges and to the cracked pavement of the mountain roads. The town breathed in the quiet that followed a storm, the streets still, the air cold and sharp. From the open window of the town's veterinary clinic, the smell of iodine and fur hung in the air, mixing with the scent of pine from the woods that loomed just beyond the property line. Inside, Ranger lay motionless on a thick fleece mat near the examination table. Though cleaned and bandaged, his body bore a history no medicine could erase. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythms, and the hum of distant voices floated toward him like a lullaby. Grace Collins sat cross-legged near him, her scrubs wrinkled and her dark hair tied in a loose bun that had nearly fallen apart. She wasn't tending to a patient now, she was waiting. Watching. Emery had been moved to the recovery room upstairs, where she slept with one hand clutching the corner of her yellow blanket and the other resting near her side, always reaching for Ranger, even in her dreams. The girl's fever had broken, but fatigue gripped her tight. Grace had been up all night, unwilling to close her eyes, her gaze switching between the monitor tracking Emery's vitals and the dog that had kept her child alive. There were 1,000 questions Grace hadn't asked yet, not to her daughter, not to the world, but foremost among them was who this dog had been before the woods, before the scars, before the silence. The bell above the clinic door jingled. Lucas Yates stepped in, removing his beanie and brushing off his boots. He looked like a man pulled between worlds, part field commander, part father figure to the town's orphans of circumstance. "Got something," he said softly, raising a folded sheet of paper. "Military K-9 registry. Took some digging, but I matched the scars, markings, and microchip code. His name is Ranger. Registered under the 191st Tactical K-9 Unit." Grace stood, brushing her hands on her pants. "And?" Lucas exhaled. Handler's name was Staff Sergeant Tobias Reyes. Decorated, honorable discharge. Ranger served 3 tours overseas, mostly recon and explosive detection. Last mission was in Baloch Valley, 7 years ago. They were ambushed. Sergeant Reyes was injured. Ranger stayed with him, until Ranger disappeared during the evacuation. Grace's breath caught. They left him behind. Not by choice. Records say there was chaos, low visibility. When backup arrived, only Reyes remained. He believed Ranger was taken. The unit searched for months, but no trace. Ranger was presumed killed in action. Grace turned her gaze to the dog, now stirring slightly, one ear twitching. He wasn't killed. He was taken, and he survived. Lucas nodded. Barely. And from the wounds I saw, he didn't just survive. He resisted. Upstairs, a soft cry echoed down the staircase. Grace was already moving. In the recovery room, Emery stirred, her cheeks flushed with warmth returning to her small face. She blinked as Grace approached. "Is he here?" she whispered. Grace knelt beside her. "He's downstairs. He's resting. Just like you." Emery's pale blue eyes scanned the ceiling. "He never left. Even when it was dark. Even when I cried. I know, baby. He saved you." Emery didn't speak for a long time. Then, softly, he had a dream. "I think, about a man. A voice." He didn't want to go until the voice came. Grace's skin prickled. "What voice?" "I don't know. But it said his name. Like he was being called home." That evening, Lucas made a call. The Reyes residence was an hour north, nestled in a wooded area outside Troutdale. Grace insisted on going, and Ranger, though still weak, rose when he saw her gather her coat, as if sensing the shift. He followed her to the car without command. Tobias Reyes lived in a small house that had once been his parents'. At 45, he was a man changed by war, tall, lean, with a weathered face and eyes that looked past people instead of into them. His dark hair was threaded with gray, and he walked with a slight limp from a hip injury sustained in the same ambush that had taken his K-9. For years, he had shut out the world. A mechanic by trade, he spent his days repairing farm trucks and his nights alone, haunted by what he believed he had lost forever. When Grace and Lucas arrived with Ranger, Toby opened the door without a word. His eyes dropped instantly to the dog. His face didn't change, but his hands gripped the doorframe. Ranger froze at the threshold. The smell was familiar. The man, older now, worn, changed, but unmistakably him. Toby's voice cracked. "Ranger?" The dog stepped forward slowly. Then a soft whine. Then a sound from deep in the chest, not a bark, not a growl, but a low, broken howl. Toby dropped to his knees. Ranger collapsed into him, head buried in the crook of his former handler's arm, tail thudding weakly against the porch floor. Toby's shoulders shook, and his hands trembled as they pressed against the fur, the ribs, the worn battle-scarred body of the dog he thought was lost to war, to the abyss. "God, I looked for you," Toby whispered. "I looked everywhere." Grace stepped back, swallowing the lump in her throat. Lucas turned away, giving them privacy. No more words were needed. They were soldiers reunited, brothers who had survived separate wars and somehow found one another in the aftershock. That night, as they drove back to Sycamore Hills, Ranger didn't curl up in the back of the clinic's truck bed like before. He sat upright, alert, one eye still facing the road ahead, the other socket catching the wind. A little more whole. A little more home. The morning light in Sycamore Hills was soft and golden, filtering through the dew-laced evergreens like a whispered promise. From the Collins household, just a short walk from the tree line, a hush had fallen over the world, a quiet broken only by the occasional chirp of a jay or the shifting paws of a large dog sleeping at the foot of a child's bed. Inside the small blue house, where light danced gently across pale walls, the presence of something unspoken had settled, a fragile calm, as if the house itself was waiting to exhale. Ranger lay coiled like a sentinel on Emery's bedroom rug. The room was filled with signs of childhood, a bookshelf packed with dog-eared adventure stories, a jar of collected feathers by the window, a mobile of wooden stars swaying above the bed. Emery still slept, her face pressed gently into her pillow, one arm outstretched toward the dog. Ranger's breathing was shallow but even, his ribs still visible beneath the bandages, but his ears flicked with every creak and sigh of the house. Downstairs, Grace stood barefoot in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee. She hadn't slept more than a few hours since the rescue. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the yellow hem of Emery's soaked dress, the bruises on her knees, the image of a silent guardian shielding her from the storm. But something had shifted inside Grace too, a space that had once been filled with exhaustion and guilt now quietly brimming with something she couldn't name yet. Maybe hope. Lucas had offered to stop by that afternoon. He had questions, and so did she. But there was something else she needed first, understanding. So while Emery slept, Grace retrieved the small folder Lucas had left behind. Inside were copies of Ranger's military record and a brief, chilling supplement marked unsanctioned possession. It detailed a long silence in the dog's record, nearly 3 years unaccounted for. Ranger, it seemed, had not merely wandered. He had escaped. It began the day of the ambush. After Sergeant Tobias Reyes was pulled from the debris of a collapsed building during a mission in Baloch Valley, Ranger was presumed lost. But in truth, he had waited beside his handler until nightfall, refusing to leave even as distant gunfire echoed. It was then that he was captured, drugged, muzzled, and loaded into a van by a group of mercenaries. Over the following months, Ranger was passed like contraband. He was recognized quickly for what he was, a finely trained war dog, capable of identifying explosives and tracking human scent for miles. Private militias, corrupt security groups, and black market dealers all tried to use him. But he would not obey. The commands were wrong. The hands were wrong. The voices bore no love, no trust. And when Ranger refused to bite, refused to attack civilians during a raid, the beatings began. They starved him. Locked him in cages. Eventually, they threw him into an underground dog-fighting ring in eastern Serbia, hoping hunger would sharpen him into something cruel. It didn't. The eye was taken there, in the pit, under the roar of men and metal gates, where one blow from a spiked collar nearly crushed his skull. He should have died, but he didn't. On a rainy night during transport between facilities, the vehicle swerved off a rural road in Montana. Ranger, bloodied and sick, escaped through a shattered window. He ran with no direction, driven by a single instinct he couldn't name, forward. He ran through valleys and over logging roads. He crossed frozen streams and stole scraps from back porches. At night, he curled under porches, in abandoned barns, his body healing slowly, without mercy. The scars healed, the eye never did. Time passed. Humans were shadows to be avoided. Until Sycamore Hills. He arrived in town like a ghost. Locals saw him now and then, a large, scarred German shepherd slinking through alleys or resting at the edge of a schoolyard fence. Children spoke of the lone soldier. No one approached. No one got close. Ranger didn't let them. He no longer knew what to trust, until that day in the woods. The butterfly had led Emery off the path. She'd been chasing its bright orange wings, laughing, clutching her little canvas bag when she slipped past the rope boundary and into the whispering trees. Ranger had been nearby, watching the fair from the shadows. He had heard her cries before the storm rolled in. Not just the cries of a child, but the wheezing, the gasping. His memory, dulled but not dead, had flared. There had once been a boy in a dusty village, an Afghan child with asthma hiding in rubble, and Ranger had found him too. He had moved through the underbrush until he found her, curled in the dirt, face tear-streaked, dress soaked, and hands trembling against her chest. When she dropped her inhaler, he had sniffed it out. When she collapsed again, he lay beside her, instinct replacing training. And when she whispered, "Don't go," something in him had listened. Now, in the warmth of her room, that memory stirred with every soft breath she took. Later that day, Emery finally woke. Grace was folding towels near the doorway when she heard her daughter's voice, soft, almost curious. "Is he still here?" "He hasn't left," Grace replied, walking in. Emery reached a hand toward the rug. "Can I sit with him?" Grace hesitated. "You're still weak." But Ranger was already rising. He stretched slowly, pads sliding across the hardwood, and walked to the side of her bed. He sat, tail thumping once. Grace helped Emery down to the rug. The little girl leaned into his shoulder, curling into his side the way she had done in the woods. Her hand ran gently across the fur near his chest, careful not to touch the scars. "He had to be brave for a long time," she whispered. Grace swallowed. "He doesn't have to be brave alone anymore." From the doorway, Lucas appeared, having arrived quietly. He watched the scene for a moment before speaking. "I think he knew you needed him before you did." Emery looked up. "Can he stay forever?" Grace met Lucas's eyes. He gave a slow nod. "Yes," Grace said. "He's not going anywhere." The air in Sycamore Hills had turned crisp, tinged with the scent of turning leaves and chimney smoke. It was the kind of late October evening where the world seemed balanced between golden light and creeping shadow. Along Elm Street, where the Collins house stood at the corner beneath a towering maple, the wind stirred in gentle bursts, sweeping orange and red leaves into shallow piles along the sidewalks. Porch lights flickered on, one by one, as the sun slipped behind the hills. Inside the house, the atmosphere was far less serene. Ranger sat near the front door, unmoving except for the slow, alert turn of his one good eye. His ears perked with every passing footstep outside. His scars were healing, though the ghost of his former life still clung to him like old dust. He remained ever watchful, present, but not settled. His new surroundings were safer, but safety was not a language he fully understood yet. Grace Collins stood at the kitchen island, a stack of opened envelopes spread before her like a battlefield. At 33, she had faced more uncertainty than most women twice her age. But tonight, for the first time in months, her hands were steady. One letter in particular rested atop the pile, the insurance settlement from her late husband's death. After nearly a year of waiting, calls, forms, denials, it had finally come through. Enough not only to cover Emery's medical bills, but to reopen the town's only veterinary clinic, which had shuttered during the pandemic. She hadn't told Emery yet. The idea of rebuilding something, of moving forward instead of simply surviving, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. As she leaned against the counter, sipping tea gone cold, her phone buzzed with a message. "Daryl Tate, heard you took in a war dog. Is that even legal? Town's not a shelter." She sighed. Darryl ran the hardware store and was never one to hide his opinions, especially when they came with a hint of fear. It wasn't the first message she'd received since the story of Ranger's rescue had made its way through town. Whispers followed them at the grocery store, at the school drop-off line, even at church. He's a weapon. What if he snaps? Dogs like that don't just stop being dangerous. None of them had seen what she had, the way he had curled around her daughter like armor. The patience in his breath. The careful restraint in his every movement. Ranger looked up at her now, as if he felt the weight of the words she hadn't said aloud. His ears twitched. Then he stood slowly, padded to her side, and leaned gently into her thigh. She smiled, placing a hand on his head. They'll see. Eventually. Upstairs, Emery hummed softly in the bathtub, bubbles piled high around her shoulders. Since the rescue, she hadn't gone anywhere without asking if Ranger could come too. He waited outside the bathroom door during baths, beside her bed during naps. She spoke to him in whispers, secrets only they seemed to understand. Later that night, after Emery had gone to bed, Grace sat on the living room floor with her laptop, looking through documents for the clinic. Behind her, the fire in the hearth crackled low. Ranger lay nearby, eyes half-lidded, but alert. Then he stiffened. His ears perked. Nose lifted. A second later, Grace heard it too, the unmistakable squeak of a back gate hinge. Then the soft crunch of boots on gravel. She rose slowly, heart racing. She stepped toward the front window and peered through the curtain. Movement, just beyond the porch. A shadow. She reached for her phone. Before her fingers could dial, Ranger shot up. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his body low, tense. A low growl formed deep in his throat, rolling like distant thunder. Then, shattering glass. A figure climbed through the side window, landing hard against the floor of the laundry room. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't lunge blindly. Instead, he moved like smoke, silent, precise. Grace stepped back, grabbing a heavy flashlight and rushing toward Emery's door. She flung it open. "Stay here," she whispered. "Lock the door." But. Now. Downstairs, a yell echoed. Ranger had found him. The intruder, a thin man in his 20s with a navy hoodie and pale, twitching hands, stood frozen in the hallway. He held a kitchen knife, but his grip was shaking. Ranger faced him down the corridor, growling softly, not advancing but holding his ground. The man took a step back. "I don't want trouble," he muttered. I just thought the house was empty." Another step back. Ranger followed, measured, slow, unrelenting. The man turned to run and made it 2 steps before Lucas Yates, having been on his routine night patrol, burst through the front door, drawn by the noise and the calls from neighbors. "Police!" Lucas shouted. The man dropped the knife instantly and threw up his hands. Within minutes, he was in cuffs, muttering excuses about addiction, desperation, and thinking no one was home. Lucas led him out, but not before turning to Grace. "You okay?" She nodded, still clutching the flashlight. "Thanks to him." Ranger sat quietly beside her, breathing steady, gaze calm. News of the break-in spread quickly. By morning, the same townsfolk who once muttered about danger were leaving bags of treats on Grace's porch. One neighbor, Mrs. Riva, a retired librarian with a cane and opinions sharper than her reading glasses, left a note pinned to a chew toy. "He's not a stray. He's a soldier. Thank you for giving him a post again." That afternoon, Grace took Emery for a walk to the old clinic space. It was dusty, cobwebbed, but still standing. She unlocked the door for the first time in months and stepped inside. Emery ran her fingers along the empty counter. "Are you going to fix it?" Grace nodded. "We're going to try." Ranger walked in behind them, sat near the window, and watched the street with one eye still scanning for danger, and the other, if it could, perhaps looking for peace. Sycamore Hills had entered its quietest season. November arrived with the scent of wood smoke and frost on windowsills. The sun rose late and left early, and a silvery mist clung to the town like an old quilt. Along the back roads toward the river, oak trees stood bare and still. It was on one such chilled morning that Grace found herself driving north with Emery asleep in the back seat and Ranger curled between them, head up, body tense, as if he knew they were headed towards something important. Lucas drove ahead of them in his old green Ford truck, the same vehicle he'd used on search and rescue patrols for over a decade. He'd called Grace 2 days prior with a request: "He deserves to know. And I think Ranger needs it too." The address he'd given belonged to a small cabin tucked into a ridge near Troutdale, Oregon, where Staff Sergeant Tobias Reyes had spent the last 6 years living alone. Injured in the same ambush that had separated him from Ranger, Toby had withdrawn from the world after his honorable discharge. His right leg had been badly damaged, and while physical therapy had restored much of his movement, something in him had never quite healed. Toby was 45 now. He wore his age like an old coat, lined with fatigue but functional. He had deep-set eyes that rarely blinked first, salt and pepper hair cut military short, and a back stiff with habit. The townspeople knew him as the quiet man at the edge of town who fixed carburetors and didn't talk much. Most didn't know he'd once commanded dogs with the precision of a heartbeat. He hadn't seen a photo of Ranger in 7 years. The knock at his door was soft. Toby opened it to find Lucas standing on the porch, one hand resting on the brim of his cap. Behind him, Grace stepped forward with Emery holding her hand. And beside them, tall and still despite the cold, was the dog he thought had died in another country. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ranger moved. Not fast, slow, measured steps forward, his nose twitching, one eye locked on the man before him. The scar on his face caught the gray morning light. A low whimper escaped his throat, barely audible, like the memory of a sound he used to make. Toby's legs gave out first. He sank to one knee, face crumpling, arms trembling. "Ranger," he breathed, voice cracking. The dog stopped inches from him. Then a beat. Then another. And then Ranger nudged his head beneath Toby's chin and stayed there, unmoving. Toby wrapped his arms around him and held tight. Grace looked away, tears stinging. Emery pressed her face into her mother's coat. Lucas exhaled. Guess he never forgot. They stayed that way for a long time. When they finally moved indoors, Toby brought out an old trunk from a hallway closet. Inside were Ranger's military photos, his original service patch, and a copy of his deployment roster. He held the patch out to Emery, who took it gently and ran her finger along the faded stitching. "He always followed orders," Toby said, voice low, "but he never did it for the command. He did it for the person." They talked for hours. Grace learned things about Ranger she'd never known, that he had tracked IEDs through mountain passes, located wounded civilians under collapsed buildings, and once dragged a fellow soldier to safety through open fire. All before he was even 4 years old. Toby's eyes lingered on the dog with a strange mixture of awe and heartbreak. "I thought I failed him. Left him behind. I carried that for years." "You didn't leave him," Grace said gently. "The war did." By late afternoon, the sky had shifted to soft gray, and Emery curled up on Toby's couch with Ranger beside her, head resting in her lap. Toby stood at the window, arms crossed, watching the horizon. "I used to write," he said suddenly. "Before the service. After the discharge, I couldn't bring myself to touch a pen." Lucas raised a brow. "And now?" Toby glanced back. "Now. I think I need to tell their stories. His. Others like him. The dogs we trained and never got to thank properly." Grace smiled. "You should." "I've got notebooks," Toby said, half smiling. "Old ones. I used to think I'd write a war novel. Maybe now I'll just start with Ranger." Later, as they packed up to leave, Toby knelt beside the dog one last time. "Wherever you choose to stay," he said, scratching the thick fur behind Ranger's ears, "just know you've done more than most men ever could. You brought her back." Ranger didn't whimper this time. He simply leaned into the touch, then walked toward the car where Emery was already waiting. Grace turned back. "You can visit. Any time." Toby nodded. "I think I will." As they drove home, Grace watched Ranger in the rearview mirror. His head was resting beside Emery's knee, one eye closed, the other fixed ahead. But something about him was different now. Not softer, exactly, still vigilant, still quiet, but at peace in a way she hadn't seen before. He'd found his handler. But he'd chosen to stay. Sycamore Hills woke to snow. Not much, just a dusting across rooftops and the browning grass that lined the town square. But it was enough to hush the world a little more, soften the edges of sidewalks and houses and breath. A crisp stillness settled in, broken only by the crunch of boots and the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the road. At the heart of town, beneath the bronze statue of the town's founder, a man who had once planted the oldest sycamore still standing, neighbors gathered in coats and scarves, holding warm cups of cider and coffee. A white banner fluttered across the gazebo, "Thank you, Ranger." Grace adjusted the collar of Emery's coat and pulled her hat down snugly. The little girl clutched something tightly in her mittened hand, a small leather collar with a brass medallion she and Grace had designed together. It wasn't fancy, just a token from the town, but it held more weight than any official medal ever could. Ranger sat beside them, calm despite the gathering crowd. He was freshly groomed, his coat dark and full again, his ribs no longer prominent. The scar across his face remained, of course, a permanent testament to all he had endured, but there was peace now behind his one amber eye. He no longer flinched at sudden movements. No longer lingered near doors. He had, in every sense of the word, come home. Lucas stood near the podium, reading from a note card. His voice carried easily across the crisp morning. "We gather here not just to thank a dog, but to recognize courage, the kind that protects without hesitation, that heals what the world forgot to mend." A few heads nodded. A few eyes misted. He was trained for war, Lucas continued, but when he had every reason to fear people, he chose instead to protect a child, shield a family, and remind us that sometimes, the bravest souls have 4 legs. He stepped aside. Grace guided Emery forward. The girl approached Ranger slowly and knelt, slipping the collar over his neck. The brass tag read, "Ranger, Guardian of Sycamore Hills." Emery kissed his muzzle. "Now everyone knows who you are." A cheer rose. Applause followed. Ranger didn't bark. He simply stood beside Emery, head high, as if he understood that this moment, this little town square, was the final chapter in a story only he could have written. Later that afternoon, the Collins house hummed with warmth. Toby sat in the armchair by the window, a worn notebook open on his knee. He had returned to Sycamore Hills for the weekend to join the ceremony, and Grace had insisted he stay a few days longer. Lucas leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping cocoa. "I still think we should have made him mayor," he joked. "Don't tempt the town," Grace replied with a grin. Ranger lay sprawled in front of the fireplace, Emery's head resting on his side as she colored. Her crayons rolled across the carpet, but she didn't mind. The only thing she looked at was the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest. Grace looked at them all, the child, the dog, the soldier, the friend. A home rebuilt not just with wood and warmth, but with the quiet labor of trust. "We're not just healing him," she said aloud. "He's healing us." Toby looked up from his notebook. "That's what good dogs do." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow. And inside, the little house on Elm Street held the sound of something rare, a silence that didn't ache, but rested. And for Ranger, scarred soldier, silent guardian, and unlikely companion, it was the sound of finally belonging. Sometimes, it is not the loudest voice that saves us, but the quiet loyalty of someone who never gives up. Ranger didn't speak. He didn't beg. He simply stayed. Through fire, abandonment, and silence, he chose again and again to protect, to love, to endure. In him, we see the resilience of those who have been broken but still stand guard at the doors of others' hearts. In him, we are reminded that healing does not come only from medicine, but from belonging, real, unwavering belonging. May we all, like Ranger, find our way back, not just to safety, but to purpose. And may we never forget to look twice at those who stand in silence, for they may be the ones carrying the weight of our salvation. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Comment below, say a prayer, and may God bless all those who guard us in ways we'll never fully understand. Amen.